Khalid ibn Walid sees this, messengers start to go out to the Mushrik army that's escaped, and he says, come back, we're now starting to win. So they turn around now and they join the forces of Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid. Remember, the only thing he has is what? Cavalry. Like he doesn't have infantrymen. What then happens is, the Prophet ﷺ, who's roughly in this area, sees the attack of Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu, and we explained before that the Prophet ﷺ starts to call out to the Muslims, which is contrary to what any normal military leader would do. A normal military leader, what would they do? The bodyguards would say, get out of here, sir, it's your time, let's take the helicopter, we have to get out of here to fight another day. But the Prophet ﷺ stays at the mountain and calls back to the Muslims, thereby exposing himself and gathering the attention of the forces of Khalid ibn Walid, which at that point in time turned their cavalry around because he's the purpose that they're after. They want to kill the Prophet ﷺ, and they charge in this direction. And the Prophet ﷺ, with the small, troop that he has at the time, some mu'arrikheen say he kept behind about 50 men. He backtracks into the mountain of Uhud. So now you have the forces of the Muslims that are in disarray. And then Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu effectively leaves them, charges against the mountain where he sees where the Prophet ﷺ is, as the Prophet ﷺ is backing up into the mountain. And obviously, some of the people that are there are fighting against this charge of Khalid ibn Walid. Many of the shuhada occur over here. Hamza radiallahu anhu has already become a shaheed before this happens. Right? By most accounts, Hamza radiallahu anhu became a shaheed in the first part before Khalid ibn Walid actually went up the mountain. We know that Wahshi went after him with a spear, and Wahshi radiallahu anhu later on recounts this in detail. I think we covered it last time. After he kills Sayyidina Hamza radiallahu anhu, he leaves the battle. He says, I had nothing else to do. That I wasn't really there to fight. I was just there to kill Hamza radiallahu anhu. So the Prophet ﷺ backs up. Now, if you ever have an opportunity, has anyone been to Uhud where they climbed this side of the mountain or walked around here? Has anyone ever done? Have you done that? Have you ever seen that crevice? You've seen the crevice. And what did they tell you about the crevice? Yeah. I don't know if I can find it for you here in these pictures. Let me.
Are you talking about the cave?
I'm talking about the cave. Yeah. Oh, you talking about December? Okay, mashallah. I'm just trying to see if there's a picture of it somewhere here. Honestly, if I can.
They have closed the cave.
They closed it. Yeah, I'm just trying to see if there's still something on Google where I can just show it. So anyway, the Prophet ﷺ retreats into the mountain, and we're going to talk more about what happened there and who was with him, and all the hadith that occurred, or many of the hadith that occurred. But effectively, it's not really a cave; it's like a crevice. Like a cave actually has borders. You can go. This is like a big crack in the wall, right? And that's where the Prophet ﷺ retreats with. Now, the Prophet ﷺ, by the time he's moving up to the mountain and all these shuhada, have occurred, the horses are not effective against the mountain. So obviously the horses can only get to a certain level. He has a group of nine fighters with him. And there are 7 Ansar and 2 of the Muhajirin, right? We actually don't know the names of the Ansar. We do know the names of the Muhajirin that were there, that were documented in the books of Sirah. And they are Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu and Abu Dujana radiallahu anhu. They are there. They're Talha ibn Ubaydillah radiallahu anhu and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu. Abu Dujana comes later. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to this situation where the Prophet ﷺ calls back to the army. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, وَالرَّسُولُ يَدْعُوكُمْ لِأُخْرَاكُمْ. And as the messenger is calling out for you to turn around and see what's behind you, right? In other words, the attack is coming from behind of the forces of Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid. As they are coming, the Prophet ﷺ sees the Quraysh coming up, and he tells the men that are with him, effectively the 9 men that are the closest of the bodyguards, who will go fight them, and they will be my companion in Jannah. And we'll talk more about the tactics that they employ as they're going up the mountain. So Talha ibn Ubaydillah radiallahu anhu says, I will do this, Ya Rasulullah. And he says, no, not you. So one of the Ansar steps up, and he goes and he fights and he becomes a shaheed. And then the Prophet ﷺ asks the question again. Another one of the Ansar gets up, and he kept Talha with him until the end. Who was Talha? Let's talk about Talha ibn Ubaydillah. Who knows anything about Talha ibn Ubaydillah? He was a relative of who? Who was he a relative of? He was the cousin of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Later on in Medina, he becomes a very rich man. Like he was one of those people that was, not to compare, but like a multi-billionaire of Medina. He later on becomes a multi-billionaire of Medina. He becomes literally, we're not talking about someone that's a millionaire, we're talking about someone that's a billionaire of Medina. And he had a business that was, our, modern day of cheese. He had effectively like a cheese business, right? And he is the one that was a very smart trader, and he becomes extremely rich. And what's the evidence of how rich he was? What did the ulama capture as evidence? Is when he died, how much money his wives got. How much money each of them, he was married, mashallah, multiple times. Like the divisions of how much the wives got was such a huge amount of money, they could only calculate how much he had. Talha ibn Ubaydillah has a very famous hadith where he goes out one night and he can't sleep. His wife actually recounts this about him. And she asks him, why can't you sleep? And he says, how can a man who has 100,000 dirham in his house? This was like 100,000 dirham was an insane amount of money. This is like somebody having $100 million in our days. How can someone who has 100,000 dirham in his house sleep when they know that there's an akhirah coming? He gets up out of bed and he gets all his workers and he distributes what he has. He distributes it to the poor, right? And so this was Talha ibn Ubaydillah. He was a very famous warrior. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, what was his specialization? Archery. So the Prophet ﷺ keeps two men behind. You know how people like say, I'm a specialist. What's your specialization? Oh, I'm a sniper. I'm a this. That's how they were as well. So Talha ibn Ubaydillah, obviously, they all knew how to use the different weapons, and his specialization was the sword, and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, his specialization was the archery, right? So that's who the Prophet ﷺ keeps behind with him. This situation is the most dangerous situation in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. If you read the entire seerah, this situation of Uhud and the Quraysh coming to attack the Prophet ﷺ as he's in Uhud was the most dangerous situation that's ever lived in. However, we know that in the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha, when she asked the Prophet, she recounts this, when she asked the Prophet ﷺ, she said, what was the worst day of your life? What was his response? The day of Ta'if. Why did he not say the day of Uhud? Because he had his companions. Any other opinions? Just to compare the two situations of the Prophet ﷺ. He was more injured than Ta'if? Yeah. Because Ta'if was about humiliation. And Ta'if, they didn't want to kill him. They didn't care about killing him. They just wanted to humiliate him. This was all like, if you die as a shaheed is one thing, if people humiliate you, it's a whole other thing. So in the case of Ta'if, it was really about the Arabs humiliating the Prophet ﷺ. But here they were out to kill him. They were out to kill him. And by the way, when you read these ahadith of Uhud, this particular situation when they were attacking the Prophet ﷺ, many of them that were approaching, so you can imagine these are horsemen charging with swords and spears and arrows, and they see where the Prophet ﷺ is, or they see the companions because he's called out. They're coming and they're saying, I'm coming to get you. To the Prophet ﷺ directly, I am coming to kill you. My only goal of being here is to actually kill you. Right? And this whole Islam thing is going to be over. So the Prophet ﷺ is now backing up into the mountain. Another situation to compare with Surah ibn Malik. Remember the situation with Surah ibn Malik? We spoke about that. Why is that not as bad?
He would not come closer to the Prophet because of
But even before that, like they saw him even before he couldn't come close. Why was that not as dangerous? Two reasons. First of all, there was two of them. There was only one of him. But that's park that one aside. Surah ibn Malik was not interested in killing. What was he interested in? The money. He was interested in the money. He was just like, I want to get you alive. I don't want to kill you. I want to bring you back alive, right? So this is the other difference between situational Surah. Okay, so the Prophet ﷺ, when he was in this crevice, he would come out and look at what was going on in the battlefield. And every time he did that, Talha radiallahu anhu would say, go back, Ya Rasulullah, I don't want you hurt. He said, Nahri bi nahrika, Ya Rasulullah. Means my chest for your chest. Go back. I want you to be safe, Ya Rasulullah. And we'll see what happens next. Sa'd radiallahu anhu was shooting arrows. You see these movies where that's what he was doing radiallahu anhu continuously. And the Prophet ﷺ was encouraging him and making dua for him. And what's the famous thing that the Prophet ﷺ said to Sayyidina Sa'd radiallahu anhu in that situation? فداك بأبي وأمي. He's the only one of the companions where the Prophet ﷺ said, he said, Irmi Sa'd fidaka bi abi wa ummi. His whole life. Fidaka bi abi wa ummi is an expression that the Arabs have, which is an expression of extreme respect, which is, the lives of my parents, are for your life. And the Prophet ﷺ said this to Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu. This is also important for us to understand the status of these companions radiallahu anhu. So choose Sa'd fidaka bi ummi. By the way, Talha and Sa'd radiallahu anhu are included amongst the 10 highest level in Jannah, right? At the time of the Prophet. Okay. The Prophet Talha now is, you can imagine the mountain is sloped. Sa'd radiallahu anhu has a higher elevation shooting the arrows. By the way, who's giving him the arrows to shoot? The Prophet. So we don't know if they had a stash in the back that the Prophet ﷺ was giving him. Some other hadiths say as the Prophet was going up the mountain and the Quraysh started to shoot their arrows, he was collecting them as they were going up the mountain and he was giving them to Sa'd radiallahu anhu. Talha ibn Ubaydillah is at the bottom and he's actually playing the role of the like how in English. And the of the Prophet ﷺ that happened. His name is Qatada ibn Nu'man al-Awsi, and he is from the Ansar. Now, what's going on in the battlefield? Well, they think the Prophet ﷺ is dead. I'll talk about that at the end, right? When they find that he's alive, it's like the Sahaba radiallahu anhum that were right in the middle of the battle now pay their attention back to where the Prophet ﷺ is, and they all run back to the mountain where he's standing in order to defend him because he's under extreme attack. Qatada ibn Nu'man al-Awsi radiallahu anhu, he goes back to the aid of the Prophet ﷺ, and the books of Sirah say he destroyed 3 or 4 different bows on that day. By the way, as did the Prophet ﷺ, as did Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. So how do you destroy a bow and an arrow? What does that mean out of usage? What does that mean? It has no more tension. You can't, there's no tension anymore. So they throw it out and they get another one, right? So this just shows you the intensity of the battle, of how many of these things, expired in the middle of this battle that they were using. And so this was Sayyidina Qatada ibn Nu'man al-Awsi. And the Prophet, and he's one of the companions that are shielding the Prophet ﷺ with his body. So as the Quraysh approach the mountain, they come into resistance, A, because of the slope of the mountain, B, because of the fact that the companions are there defending him, so they can't get close. But they see that that's where the Prophet ﷺ is with, so what are they turning to fight him with? Their arrows, because the arrows are a long-distance weapon, right? And so he is also the one that's fending off the arrows with his shield against the Prophet ﷺ, right? As they're retreating back into the mountain. By the way, the Prophet ﷺ has a hadith here where he said, "Ala inna al-quwwata ar-ramy," and he repeats that twice. Prophet ﷺ says that, "Ala inna al-quwwata ar-ramy," most certainly the power of the army or the power of defense is in the rami, which is in the bow and arrow or modern day weapons or artillery or whatever. This is the power, right? This is the power. As Qatada radiallahu anhu is defending the Prophet ﷺ, he gets hit with an arrow in his eye. He gets hit with an arrow in his eye and he loses his eye. And the Prophet ﷺ, he cries out, and the Prophet ﷺ makes a dua for Allah to protect Qatada in his eye in the same way that he protected the Messenger ﷺ. And he takes his eye and he rubs it back, and he makes a dua that this eye be better than it was before. And Qatada radiallahu anhu says, his eye came back and it was perfect vision, and it was better than the other eye that he had before. That eye that went back into his, because of the Prophet ﷺ. How many times was the Prophet ﷺ hurt in the Battle of Badr? We know he was hurt. Do we have any opinions about this? How many times was he hurt? Let's stop reading. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times? Books of Sirah say once, books of Sirah say twice, books of Sirah say 3 times. By most accounts, it was probably 3 times, and we'll go through what the 3 times were. This is the accumulated total of the hadith. He was wounded on 3 separate occasions in this particular situation in Uhud. The first time was he was hit by a rock in the face. So the mushriks, as they're attacking, and this was just a technique that they used at the time, they obviously used bows and arrows, they used swords, they used spears, but they also threw rocks at each other. I mean, even if you see some of these older movies of them charging the castle or the wall, they have men behind with big rocks up at the top, throwing it at the attackers, right? The defenders are throwing the rocks. So they would employ this technique of throwing the rocks, right? It's also said in one of the books of hadith, and I'm not sure exactly how effective this is, but one of the books of Sirah, that if you remember this guy called Abu Amir al-Rahib, the one that came and he tried to negotiate, and the Prophet ﷺ ended up calling him Abu Amir al-Fasiq, that he took some men and he dug up some holes in the back, one of which the Prophet ﷺ fell in, and that's when he got hit in the face with the rock. But the Prophet ﷺ definitely got hit in the face with a rock. So that was the first time he was wounded. The second time he was wounded was one of the arrows launched and landed in the cheek of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ had a helmet, and the helmet had side plates, and this went in front of the side plate and into the molar of the Prophet ﷺ, which is extremely painful. So, and the arrow just stuck there. Right? The arrow just got stuck in the face of the Prophet ﷺ and dislodged his molar and got stuck. The third attack on the Prophet ﷺ, this shows you the danger that he was in on the day of Uhud, was from one of the mushrikeen. By the way, the shooter of the arrow has a name. Does anyone know the name of the one who shot the arrow? The one who shot the arrow, his name is Utbah ibn Abi Waqqas. Anyone know who he's related to? He's the brother of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. You imagine, so the brother of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas is shooting an arrow at the Prophet ﷺ, and his brother is on the first line of defense against the for the Prophet ﷺ. The third incident was, I think his name was Ibn Qami'ah. He was one of the mushrikeen, and he charged with his horse at the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, "I am here to kill you. I am here to kill you." And he's charging with his horse at the Prophet ﷺ. He swings his sword, and Talha ibn Ubaydillah radiallahu anhu deflects the blow. He defends the blow of the horse with his shield, which, by the way, is very difficult to do, because remember, these horsemen are charging with speed, they have weapons, they have armor on them, just from the momentum of the horse. Even if the horseman didn't swing the sword, it's still a lot of power. So he swings his sword, which is deflected by Talha radiallahu anhu, and not 100%, and the rest of the power hits the helmet of the Prophet ﷺ's head, and this is when the helmet goes inside his other jaw. So the Prophet ﷺ effectively has 3 types of wounds. He has the wound to the face, he has the arrow, and he's now on the other side of the face, which the helmet generally blocks, but the part of the helmet on the side goes also into the cheeks of the Prophet ﷺ. This is causing, obviously, extreme pain and bleeding, and we'll talk more about the bleeding of the Prophet ﷺ here in a second. The Prophet ﷺ, as he's retreating and he's hurt, and he has a very famous hadith when he sees himself how hurt he is from the Quraysh. What's this hadith?
Forgive the people who have their prophet.
That's it. Yeah. Okay, so how can the people who do this to their messenger, whose messenger is calling to Islam, how can they have any success? How can they have any success? And then, so after the Battle of Uhud, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has an ayah in the Quran specific to what the Prophet ﷺ said. Does anyone know the ayah? MashaAllah. MashaAllah. Ayah number 128 in Surah Al-Imran is revealed as an outcome of what the Prophet ﷺ said. How can they ever be successful when they do this to the messenger? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَيْسَ لَكَ مِنَ أَمْرِ شَيْءٍ. You have nothing to do with the outcome of what happens to these people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet ﷺ. He's telling us, by the way. He's telling us. لَيْسَ لَكَ مِنَ أَمْرِ شَيْءٍ أَوْ يَتُوبَ عَلَيْهِمْ أَوْ يُعَذِّبَهُمْ فَإِنَّهُ ظَالِمٌ. It's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to decide what He wants to do with them. Either He's going to punish them or He's going to forgive them. But either way, because of what they did to you on the day of Uhud, they are definitely wrong. They are definitely low, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to teach us a lesson. You know, when we get all fired up and we see someone doing something crazy to Muslims or whatever, like this person is 100% going to, we don't know 100% anything. You understand? It's not for us to decide, right? We only know what we see, but we can't decide the outcome that ultimately belongs only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Another ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّمَا عَلَيْكَ الْبَلَاغُ وَعَلَيْنَا الْحِسَابُ. إِنَّمَا عَلَيْكَ الْبَلَاغُ وَعَلَيْنَا الْحِسَابُ, which is a lesson to us also when we make da'wah to people, like, say, oh man, this brother's been coming to the masjid for 17 years, hasn't taken the shahada, his sister, this, like, leave it alone. Our job is only to do what? Deliver the message. What happens at the end with what the other side translates it to is up to them. It's not up to us to force anything, and we don't control the hearts of any people, right? So this is also a message to us and how we treat or how we deal with the the disbelievers and so forth. So question, why was the Prophet ﷺ wounded? Why was he wounded? Because another hadith of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, I don't know if I said this last time. Now, before I say the hadith of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, part of the techniques that they employed in the retreat of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So you can imagine they're retreating and they want to keep the Prophet ﷺ secure. Part of what they were doing was some of them were surrounding him, but some of them were moving in different directions of the mountain to take the attention from the Quraysh away from the Prophet ﷺ. You know, when you see in movies, like they go and they hide behind the rock and then they come up and they start to fire, and then the other guy does the same thing on that side. Part of what they're doing isn't just obviously to get the enemy in defense of the Prophet, but it's to take the attention away from the Prophet ﷺ. And in one of the hadith of Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, because obviously they couldn't keep track exactly of where he was going, he says, I turned around and I saw the Prophet ﷺ surrounded by many of these people of the Quraysh, and he had two men that I'd never seen before, fending off the attacks like amazing fighters. You know, like you see these samurai movies where they're like that's what they were doing around the Prophet ﷺ. Who were they? Jibreel and Mikael. And this is the only time that he's ever seen them, because he says in the hadith, he says, I never saw them again, ever again. Never saw them in my life. So the question is, why was the Prophet ﷺ? So he clearly had the defense of the angels. Muslims were defending them. He's the messenger of Allah. Why was he wounded? Could the angels not have defended him? Could the angels have defended him? Yes or no? Were the angels amazing fighters? Yes or no? Does he have the protection of Allah? Yes or no? Okay, so why was he wounded? He's a human. Lesson for the Sahaba? Just the Sahaba? Lesson for the Ummah? Okay, lesson for the Ummah. Anything else? Sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching the Ummah. As part of whatever you do, when it comes to fighting for freedom, or defending yourself, or defending your home, there's a high probability you get hurt. And the number one human being in nobility is the Prophet ﷺ. And the example is he got hurt in Uhud. You expect not to have pain when you defend yourself? Of course you'll have pain. Look at the example of the Prophet ﷺ and what he went through. This is the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Ummah. If the Prophet ﷺ can be hurt, how could you expect not to be hurt? This is part of the effort, part of the struggle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala imposes on the Ummah, and part of his shot, right? Part of his shot. Sayyidina Mus'ab ibn Umayr was one of the first people that was targeted by the mushrikeen of Khalid ibn Walid when they came back with the horses. Why was he targeted first? He was the flag bearer. Sayyidina Mus'ab ibn Umayr was targeted because he was the flag bearer. And when he died and when he became a shaheed in the battle, Sayyidina Mus'ab ibn Umayr, a man from Quraysh, his name is Abdullah ibn Qami'ah, by the way, he's the same one that came after the Prophet ﷺ later with the horse. He says, I have killed Muhammad. So he screams in the battle, I have killed Muhammad. Why does he say that? What? Yeah. So some people say that Sayyidina Mus'ab ibn Umayr looked like the Prophet ﷺ or had similar eyes. Other books of Seerah say that the Prophet ﷺ on that day gave him his cloak. He was wearing the cloak of the Prophet ﷺ, and the mushrikeen didn't know. So when Sayyidina Mus'ab radiallahu anhu became a shaheed, he yelled out, I have killed Muhammad. Now, the companions fighting, so they were already in disarray, they were already in retreat and attacked from behind. The companions also felt extremely let down, right? So that were in the area. So there's a hadith narrated There's a hadith narrated by Anas ibn Malik, who says, my uncle was there on the day of Uhud. And the uncle's name is Anas ibn al-Nadr. Anas ibn al-Nadr is the uncle of Anas ibn Malik. And this hadith is in Bukhari. And he says that after this Qami'ah, Ibn Qami'ah yelled, I killed Muhammad, it was demoralizing to the companions. And he sees them kind of like slowing down. And he says, why are you slowing down? Why are you not like in action like you were before? And they tell him, haven't you heard the Prophet ﷺ has been killed? So he says, well, if he was killed, no one knows the truth at this stage, right? There's confusion everywhere. He says, well, if he was killed, the Lord of Muhammad ﷺ is still alive. You should get up and fight and die on what he died. At that stage, they don't know if he's dead or alive. So he tells them he should go and fight and die on what he died, on the religion that he died. And then he has a very famous narration. He has a very famous statement. Anyone knows the statement? Something about a smell? Something about a smell? I smell Jannah from the mountain of Uhud. He says, I smell Jannah from the mountain of Uhud. So he says, I smell Jannah from Uhud. So then he says the following. He says, I ask forgiveness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the Muslims from what they've done. And I disassociate myself from the people of Quraysh on coming to attack the Prophet, right? And what's the forgiveness that he's asking for the Muslims? That they disobeyed the Prophet, right? That they disobeyed the Prophet when he told them to stay and not come down unless he orders them specifically to come down. And he goes and he fights and he becomes a shaheed. In that, there is an ayah in the Quran. Does anyone know the ayah in the Quran revealed specifically about this particular companion when this particular situation happens, and to every other person that follows in the path of this person? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ رِجَالٌ, complete the ayah. صَدَقُوا مَا عَاهَدُوا. There are men who have been truthful to the promise they made to Allah, to the commitment they made to Allah. No matter how difficult it is, they are standing firm on their commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the example of Sayyidina Anas. The first one that realizes the Prophet ﷺ hasn't died, so this is what happens right after that, is Sa'd ibn Malik. Does anyone know who Sa'd ibn Malik is? Sa'd ibn Malik is mentioned in the Quran, but his story doesn't happen until later in the Battle of Tabuk. What does he do?
He's from Al-Fatih.
He doesn't go to the battle. He doesn't go to the Battle of Tabuk and he doesn't have an excuse. He's the first one that realizes that the Prophet ﷺ is alive, and so he yells at the Sahaba and he says the Prophet ﷺ is still alive, right? Ka'b ibn Malik. Yeah, Ka'b ibn Malik. Yeah, and he's the one who had the ayah about the ones that stay down. And he sees the Prophet ﷺ. He goes to the Prophet ﷺ, who's already wounded, and he gives him his armor. He takes off his armor. Armor was the number one thing you needed in battle. You understand? Like everything is swords and spears. That's what defended yourself. He took it off, had nothing on him, and he gives his armor to the Prophet ﷺ. And at the end of the battle, he had over 20 wounds in him. Now, when the companions know that the Prophet ﷺ is alive and he's in the back and he's going up, what do they all do? They retreat and they run after the Prophet ﷺ to defend him. Everyone does that, right? And including Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Sayyidina Umar, Al-Khattab, Sayyidina Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, they all joined. Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, by the way, what is his relationship to Khadija radiallahu anha? Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, he is the nephew, right? And he gets married to who? Asma bint Abi Bakr. Was their son? Abdullah ibn Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. No, his name. Abdullah ibn Zubayr ibn al-Awwam has a huge history. They all do. But even after the Khilafah, Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, he's the one that effectively liberates Tunisia, Algeria, like all these areas later on. This is Abdullah ibn Zubayr. And he was born in, I don't know if we said this or not, he was born during the Hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ in Qida. He was born in Qida as the Prophet ﷺ was making Hijrah, and the Prophet ﷺ was very happy when she gave birth to him, and he loved them both very much. So, Sayyidina Abu Bakr has a hadith relating to chasing after the Prophet ﷺ up the mountain when they saw that he was still alive. So you can just imagine, these companions are tired, they've now been attacked from behind, the whole battle situation is changing, and all they can think about is defending the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Bakr is charging up the mountain, right? Oh, they have heavy equipment, they have armor, and so on and so forth. And he says, I saw one man defending the Prophet ﷺ up at the top from all the Qurayshi men that had gotten to him. And I said, oh Allah, let that be Talha ibn Ubaidillah, and it was Talha ibn Ubaidillah. He's one of the ones that the Prophet ﷺ kept behind. And then he says the point. He says, I was running as fast as I could. This is saying that Abu Bakr was alone. And then he says, I also saw one man running very, very fast, and he passed me up the hill. He passed me up the hill. You know when you're, does anyone here do like athletics or Spartan races or sprints on the treadmill or anything like that? CrossFit? CrossFit? No one? Okay, so let's pretend he does. This fellow does. And you know, when you're running as fast as you can, like this, think about that for a second. And then someone just comes and passes you. You're like how fast is this guy running? This is kind of what Abu Bakr is saying. Like, I'm going up the hill and he just passes me like I'm basically standing still. And this was Sayyidina Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah. And then he says, we got to the Prophet ﷺ, and we saw that this arrow was in his face, and we saw that the helmet was also in his face. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu wanted to be the one that actually takes it out of the face of the Prophet ﷺ and make it up to him. And Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu says, absolutely not. He effectively, like Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was a soft man. Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu was like, stand back, this is mine. Like, you're not going to touch this. Now, what approach could he take to get the arrow out of the cheek of the Prophet? But that's what he did. But why did he do that?
His head.
No, hang on. Because he didn't want to hurt him more. They see the Prophet ﷺ hurt, and they want to relieve the pain and minimize the damage and not cause more pain. And the only way he could come up with, he didn't do it with his hand. He could have grabbed him by his cheek. He didn't do that. He actually bit it by the teeth to make it as soft as possible. And in the process of pulling out the arrow, he breaks his teeth. So this is the one side of the arrow that landed in the cheek of the Prophet ﷺ. And then they have an argument about what? Him and Abu Bakr. They have one on the other side. And Abu Bakr, he says, no, I'm going to take it out. And he bites it again. So now he's pulling out, imagine an arrow, a helmet like that has two things going down like that. And this is now stuck in the other side. And Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu pulls that side of the helmet from his mouth, and then even loses more of his teeth, 1 to 2 teeth in the process. After Abu Bakr let him do it. So this is another one of those situations that occurred. I want to talk about something really important. You remember in Mecca when the Prophet ﷺ was praying at the Kaaba, and these nasty mushrikeen came and made fun, and they said, what do we do? What do we do? And then a really nasty man went to get the entrails of the camel and throw it on the back of the Prophet ﷺ. You remember what that man's name was? Ubay ibn Khalaf. Ubay ibn Khalaf. Actually, it's not that important that you don't remember his name, because these people are in the trash can of history, like many people are anyway. But he's the one that effectively took the intestines of the camel, and he threw them on the back of the Prophet ﷺ. And he would say to the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca, one day I'm going to kill you. He would say this to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ responded to him one time. He says, "Bal ana aquluka, inshallah." No, I am the one that will kill you, inshallah. When the Prophet ﷺ gets sick of him at the end. This was, by the way, the only time that the Prophet ﷺ has ever said that. In Uhud, he is on a horse. And he sees the Prophet ﷺ, and he charges for the Prophet ﷺ, and he says, now's my chance. And he's yelling at him, and he says, I will kill you. And the Sahaba huddle around the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ says, stand back, I have to kill him myself. This situation is the only situation narrated in the whole of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, killing someone in battle. This is it. This is the only one. It happened in Uhud with Ubay ibn Khalaf. And the companions that narrate this hadith, they say that the Prophet ﷺ took a spear, and There's two descriptions of this that are just beautiful. One says he took it, like basically he throws it and it lands in the neck of Ubay ibn Khalaf. But the other one says, has a little bit more of what he did before. He says he picked up the spear, and if you get pick something up like that and you shake it, like you're ready to throw, then you throw it. The Sahabi says, when the Prophet ﷺ shook it, we felt like we were all shaking just by him moving the spear like this, like how rough it was when the Prophet ﷺ did it. And the spear penetrates the armor, so he has a head helmet and he has armor up to here, and it goes right in the middle and it lands in the neck of Ubay ibn Khalaf. Now, this is amazing because it actually doesn't kill him on the spot. Okay, so the penetration may not have been that deep. He runs back to the back of the army and he says to them, Muhammad has killed me. Muhammad's like, get me aid, get me 911, I'm hurt, give me the medic, right? Muhammad, and they look at him and they're like, you're fine. This is like a flesh wound that hardly penetrated your neck. And he says to them, he told me in Mecca he was going to kill me. He says, Wallahi, if he had even just spat on me, I would have died. In the retreat of the army of the Quraysh, he dies, he starts to yell and he starts to scream, and he dies in a valley called Raghib. He dies in a valley called Raghib in an inconspicuous grave. We know that the people that are killed by the messengers of Allah, here's an example of one, are the worst of people on the earth. The worst of people. Like, you can't get lower than this if a messenger has to kill you himself, right? And there's a hadith, a narration by Abdullah ibn Umar that I find amazing. Years later, after all of this has ended, Abdullah ibn Umar is traveling through this particular valley, and it's at night, and he sees a fire that looks peculiar, and he goes to look at the fire, and he sees a man coming out of this fire, and the man says, "Thirst, thirst." He doesn't say, "I'm thirsty." He just says, "Thirst, thirst." And then he sees behind this man an angel pulling him back, and the angel says to Abdullah ibn Umar, "Don't give him anything. This is the one that the Prophet ﷺ has given." Allahu this is the narration of Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Umar about Ubay ibn Khalaf, and this is narrated in the death of Ubay ibn Khalaf. And the hadith of Prophet ﷺ, that these are the worst of people that Allah got angry. We're going to wrap up in a minute, and we've been at it for a while. At the very end, in order to the Prophet ﷺ is bleeding, and he bled continuously. And Ali ibn Abi Talib tries to get him water. The water's dirty. The Prophet first used it just to wash. Then they got him cleaner water, and the bleeding didn't stop until Fatima radiallahu anha brought a mixture of the straw that they used to sleep on and dates, and put it in fire and used that effectively to stop the bleeding. You know how today they use glue, like in battle to glue the wound together? That was their version of glue for it. That was the only way that the Prophet ﷺ face stopped bleeding. They prayed Dhuhr, and the Prophet ﷺ prayed sitting down, and all the companions prayed sitting down behind him after this happened. The women, by the way, played also a magnificent role in Uhud. So we know Nusayda, for example, defended the Prophet ﷺ actually fighting. Fatima radiallahu anha, Aisha ibn Sulaym was another one of the companion women that actually joined the battle, but they were acting as nurses. So they were carrying water literally from Medina to the men of right. We talked about how that was a 3 kilometer route. How did we know that the battle was over? How did the Muslims know? When did we call it done? When did we call it a day? When? Quraysh left, okay. Something very specific happened.
He called the one.
That's it. Abu Sufyan came back. So Abu Sufyan, by the way, was amongst the people that retreated right at the beginning when they were smashed by the Muslims. And they literally had to go and get him. So he's like, go find him. You gotta come back and tell him we won. So he now comes back. He actually comes back before that, but he comes back and he starts to yell up the mountain. And the first question he asks is Muhammad alive? So he knows they're up there, but he doesn't see them, he doesn't know, is Muhammad alive? And the Prophet said, don't respond. Don't respond to him. Then he says, is the son of Abu Quhafa alive? Who's the son of Abu Quhafa? Abu Bakr. He says, don't respond. And then he says, is it the son of Ibn Khattab, son of Khattab alive? And the Prophet ﷺ says, don't respond to him. And then he yells out to his army magnificently, we've killed them all. By the way, notice how he knows. Abu Sufyan knows who's like in the leadership, who's going to help really protect this deen and driver. He knows already, right? And he says we've killed them all, and the Prophet and then Sayyidina Umar he cannot contain himself, and he says, "Kadabti adu Allah." So he yells on the top of the mountain, you lied, you enemy of Allah. They're all alive, and you'll see what they'll do. Something to that effect. And then he responds back, Abu Sufyan, and he says, "Al-harbu sijal," like wars in turns. One day we win, one day you win. One day we win, one day you win. Right? By the way, this was the same statement that Abu Sufyan used to Abu Sufyan uses the same with Halaqa. When he goes up to Palestine, remember, and they call him into the palace, he says, Al-Harbu Sijab, and he's like, who wins? He says, Al-Harbu Sijab, like one day we win, one day they win, right? And then he says to the Muslims, you will find mutilation of the bodies among the dead. In other words, when you come down and you look at your dead, you'll find some mutilation of the bodies. Abu Sufyan says to them, he says, I didn't command that. I didn't order them to do that. However, I don't mind that it happened. I don't mind that it happened. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu responds, and he says, the difference is our dead are in Jannah and your dead are in Jahannam. Right? And then Abu Sufyan says, A'lu Hubal, or Hubal, or Hubal. May Hubal be mighty and wonderful. And the Prophet ﷺ now says what? Ajibu. He says, answer him. Now answer him. The Prophet ﷺ didn't tell him to answer. He didn't want to dignify him with the responses about himself or Abu Bakr or Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab. But when he now starts to talk about Allah, the Prophet ﷺ is now going to respond. So he says, Ajibu. And they say, what did we say, Rasul? What did we say, Rasul? What did he say? Allahu A'ala wa Ajal. Allahu A'ala wa Ajal. So when he says, A'lu Hubal, they respond, Sayyidina Umar, he says, Allahu A'ala wa Ajal. And then he says, Lana al-Uzza wa la Uzza lakum. So Hubal, by the way, anyone know who Hubal is? Hubal was the very first one that they worshipped. Like Hubal has a special place with the Arabs because literally it was the first thing that they started to worship ever since after the time of Nuh. So this is like shirk at a very ancient level, right? And then he says, and the Prophet ﷺ tells them to respond, Allahu mawlana wa la mawla lakum. Allahu mawlana wa la mawla lakum. And then he asks to speak to Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab, and the Prophet ﷺ sent him down, and then he asks him. So this is now a messenger, he's not going to get killed. He says, are they really alive? Like, are you? And he says, yes, we're all alive. And he says, Wallahi, I trust you more than I trusted the Qadi and the one that came and fired the arrow of the Prophet ﷺ. I trust what you say more than I trust him. Then he finally told him, our next time that we meet is going to be when? This is how the conversation ended. The next time we meet will be next year at Badr. We're going to come back and we're going to fight you guys next year in Badr. Because he said, this is for the exchange of Badr. Next year we're going to go back to where this all started in Badr, and we're going to defeat you in Badr. The last thing that I'll just say, and then we'll wrap up. We don't have time to get into the results, but the Prophet ﷺ wanted to make sure that they really retreated back to Mecca and not go towards Medina. And the Prophet ﷺ told the companions, he said, if we find out that they're going back to Medina, we're all going to pack up and we're going to go and fight. They're all already wounded, tired, obviously, from this outcome. But the Prophet ﷺ says, we'll go back and fight them if they're going to Medina. And he sends after the Mushrik army, Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib. So the Mushriks pack up, they go effectively around the mountain. So they are here in this area. And when they get to that area, they swap out the horses for the camels, which is, by the way, how the Arabs did war. So the camel was the luxury vehicle, the horse was the tank. Right? So remember how we said the camels were used for transportation. So they left, they took the horses, they dragged the horses behind them and rode the camels. That means that they're heading back to Mecca, right? So this was the end of Uhud. So next time, inshallah, we'll talk about the results of Uhud. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى ال محمد كما باركت على ابراهيم وعلى ال ابراهيم في العالمين انك حميد مجيد. اللهم اغفر للمسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات الاحياء والاموات انك سميع قريب مجيب الدعوات. اللهم اعز الاسلام وانصر المسلمين. اللهم اعز الاسلام وانصر المسلمين. اللهم اعز الاسلام وانصر المسلمين. اللهم احفظ اخواننا في فلسطين. اللهم احفظ لأمراضكم والعينك التي لا تنام. اللهم انصرهم على أعدائهم وأعدائنا نصرا مؤزرا. اللهم انفر الرعب في قلوب أعدائهم. اللهم اشف أشفاءهم وصائرهم من زلزال أقدامهم. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله. آمين. جزاكم الله خير. وسيلة